Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we are plunging into the challenging but, well, profoundly influential political thought of St. Augustine. And just to kick things off, let's start with a line that really stopped me in my tracks. From the source material you shared, St. Augustine's assertion that without justice, what are kingdoms but great robberies?
Mm.
I mean, that's not exactly your typical view of government, is it?
It certainly isn't. And that provocative statement is really just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to Augustine's unique perspective. It's a perspective forged in a time of just immense upheaval.
Right.
Our guide for this deep dive is the excerpt you've provided from Brian R. Nelson's Western Political Thought. And we're aiming to really unpack the key insights and, yeah, sometimes surprising facts about how Augustine saw politics, offering you, our listener, a kind of shortcut to understanding this really pivotal figure.
And understanding Augustine, I mean, it really requires understanding the world he lived in. Our source paints such a vivid picture of that historical stage. The 5th century AD, with the Western Roman Empire just crumbling under the weight of invasions.
Yeah, the so-called barbarian invasion.
Exactly.
Yep.
And Rome itself, the Eternal City, was famously sacked by the Goths in 410 AD. That's an event Augustine witnessed firsthand. I mean, can you imagine living through that?
Yeah.
The apparent end of civilization as you know it?
It's hard to overstate how much that must have shaped him. And while the western half was collapsing, the Eastern Roman Empire, centered in Constantinople, it continued to flourish. This Eastern realm actually became a crucial repository of classical learning.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, Roman law, for instance, saw incredible development there, which led much later to the recovery of texts like the Justinian Code in the 12th century. And even later, Greek philosophy, too, would find its way back west, often preserved and transmitted via the East. So you have this real dynamic tension, collapse here, preservation and development over there.
And the source notes that within the vast kind of autocratic Roman state itself, creative political philosophy had basically stalled. The sheer scale of the empire, its remote and often arbitrary power, it just wasn't fertile ground for that kind of participatory, community-focused political thinking you saw in ancient Greece.
Right. People weren't really looking to the polis or the state for meaning or fulfillment anymore. Not in the same way. They were starting to seek something else entirely.
Salvation, basically.
Exactly. That something else was salvation. The old state-integrated pagan religions were giving way to new belief systems, often imported from the East, which offered salvation outside the existing political order. And the source highlights Christianity's rise in this context, noting it was initially seen as quite challenging, maybe even hostile to the state.
Oh, so.
Well, early Christians demanded a primary allegiance to God and the church that, superseded loyalty to the emperor or the state. That was a pretty radical concept compared to the classical world where religious and political identities were often deeply intertwined.
But then everything changed dramatically. In 381 AD, Emperor Theodosius, I made Christianity the official state religion of the empire. The source really points to this as a pivotal moment.
It absolutely was. The immediate expectation of the Second Coming, it seemed less urgent, perhaps. And suddenly politics mattered again, but now it had to be understood from a Christian perspective. Christians had to develop a coherent political philosophy. They needed to address their relationship with the state, including that tricky question of the appropriate balance between church and state power.
And that's where Augustine steps onto the intellectual stage. He's sort of propelled by this need for a Christian political theory in this brand new era.
Yeah, the source presents him as the first truly important Christian political theorist, though maybe a reluctant one, compelled by circumstances. His massive work, The City of God, it wasn't written in a vacuum.
Right, as a response.
It was a direct response to pagan critics who, especially after the shock of the 410 sack of Rome, were blaming Christianity for weakening the empire and causing its decline. He felt he had to defend his faith and articulate a robust Christian view of history, society, and importantly, the state.
Okay, so that really sets the stage. Our mission today, then, pulling directly from these specific pages of Nelson's text, is to guide you, our listener, through Augustine's intricate and, let's face it, often challenging ideas. We want to understand his unique perspective, so deeply shaped by these turbulent times and his own complex personal and intellectual journey.
And see just how dramatically his views on human nature, the state, politics, how they diverge from the classical Greek and Roman thinkers we might be more familiar with. It's kind of a shortcut, really, to understanding a foundational thinker whose ideas still resonate today, even if they make us a bit uncomfortable.
Definitely uncomfortable sometimes. Okay, let's unpack this by starting with the man himself and the context that shaped him. St. Augustine lived from 354 to 430 AD, so squarely in that period of profound Roman decline.
Yeah, and as the source emphasizes, living through such chaotic and uncertain times, watching civilization as he knew it kind of crumble, witnessing the actual sack of Rome in 410, it profoundly affected him. This wasn't just abstract philosophy for him, it was lived, visceral experience informing his thought.
And beyond just the external chaos of the collapsing empire, his personality, as the source describes it so vividly, was dramatically shaped by these intense internal contradictions. He literally embodied the clash between the old pagan order he was educated in and the emerging Christian world he eventually converted to.
You see it so starkly in his family life. He had a devout Christian mother, St. Monica, who desperately wanted his conversion, and then a pagan father. His formal education in Carthage was steeped in the pagan classics, Cicero, Virgil, the great Roman literary figures.
The standard education of the time for someone of his class.
Absolutely. And his early adult life before his conversion, which happened when he was 32, was, as the source puts it, spent in periods of pagan excess. He was pursuing worldly ambitions, pleasures.
Living the life, so to speak.
In a way, yes. And then his journey took him to major intellectual centers like Rome and Milan. There he encountered and was deeply influenced by prominent Christian saints, which culminated in that dramatic, life-altering conversion where he renounced worldly pleasures and embraced a more ascetic life.
So these personal experiences, this real push and pull between competing worlds and desires, they weren't just biographical footnotes. They fed directly into his intellectual framework, didn't they? Especially his inclination towards dualistic thinking.
Oh, definitely. The source highlights two key influences before his conversion that were crucial in shaping this dualistic nature. The first one is Manichaeism.
Ah, the Manichaeans. I've heard of them. Weren't they the ones with the whole light versus darkness thing?
Pretty much. They were a religious sect with a really dualistic cosmology. They taught that the universe was basically the battleground between two co-equal, autonomous, and eternal principles. Good, which they associated with spirit and light, and evil, associated with matter and darkness.
Okay. And the source notes that while Augustine later abandoned Manichaeism, he rejected the theological idea that good and evil were co-equal eternal forces.
Right. For Orthodox Christianity, God is supreme. Evil is a lack or perversion, not an equal power.
But temperamentally, this source argues, he remained a dualist in that Manichaean mold. This predisposition towards seeing things in terms of stark opposition, light-dark, good-devil, was reinforced by another significant intellectual influence from his pre-conversion days, Neoplatonism, particularly the philosophy of Plotinus.
Right. Plotinus extended Plato's philosophical dualism, drawing a really sharp distinction between the intelligible world of eternal forms or ideas, that's the world of true reality, accessible only through intellect, and the sensory world of appearances, the world of transient, imperfect matter that we perceive through our senses.
And Plotinus argued that the highest calling for the soul was to, transcend the sensory world, get beyond the physical.
Exactly, to purify itself and seek a mystical union with the One, the ultimate ineffable reality, which resided entirely in that intelligible spiritual realm. The sensory world, including all the messy affairs of politics and worldly life, was seen as secondary, maybe even a distraction. It wasn't something to be reformed or perfected.
So Neoplatonism also pushed him towards this kind of philosophical dualism.
The source argues it did, yeah. It reinforced a separation very similar to Manichaeism's good versus evil split. It instilled in him, it seems, a deep suspicion of the material world and a profound focus on the spiritual realm as the place where true value and fulfillment are found.
So if we need to grasp one fundamental concept to really understand Augustine, drawing from this source, is that he is, right down to his core, a dualistic thinker.
Yes, that's absolutely the key takeaway. The source states it explicitly. For Augustine, things tend to be black or white, good or evil, sacred or profane. There's very little middle ground or blending in his framework.
And his turbulent historical circumstances, the collapsing empire, the clash of paganism and Christianity, combined with these powerful early intellectual and religious influences, Manichaeism, Neoplatonism, they all pushed him towards this either-or way of thinking.
Strongly propelled him, yes. And this profound dualism, it runs throughout his political thought, as we'll definitely see. It explains both what some might see as its limitations, its weaknesses, but also, paradoxically, its enduring strengths and its piercing insights.
And this dualism is deeply tied into his understanding of human nature, which is firmly rooted in those Christian doctrines of sin and salvation.
Our source makes it crystal clear that Augustine's entire political philosophy is basically premised on these specific theological ideas.
It fundamentally begins with the doctrine of original sin,
Hmm.
the belief that God created humanity for a state of peace and harmony, but Adam and Eve's original transgression, their great sin, fundamentally altered human nature for the worse.
This corrupted nature, tainted by evil, was then transmitted, passed down to all succeeding generations. So for Augustine, humans are born not as blank slates or inherently good beings, but as tainted, or as the source puts it rather starkly, depraved right from birth.
Depraved from birth. That's quite a starting point.
It is. And salvation then is offered through Christ, but in Augustine's particular interpretation as presented here, salvation isn't something you earn through good works or reason. It's solely the result of God's undeserved gift of grace, freely given, and crucially, given only to some few, the elect.
Which leads directly to his famously austere, maybe even harsh doctrine of predestination, the idea that individuals are predetermined by God for either heaven or hell.
Right. Now, the source is careful to note that this specific stark version of predestination isn't current Catholic dogma anymore, but it was absolutely central to Augustine's thought. And importantly, the source explains why this didn't seem harsh to him.
How could it not seem harsh?
Because he believed human nature was so utterly corrupted by original sin that all of humanity, just in their natural state, deserved hell. That was the baseline. Therefore, the fact that God, in his infinite mercy, chose to save even some was, for Augustine, not an act of injustice towards the others, but actually overwhelming proof of God's incredible goodness and grace towards the few. It really highlights the depth of his pessimism about unredeemed human nature.
Wow. Okay. And the source makes a really fascinating point here about how radical this Christian concept of sin was compared to how the ancient Greeks understood evil.
It's a fundamental paradigm shift, really. The ancient philosophers we often discuss, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, they largely understood evil and virtue in secular, human-centered terms. Remember that sophist idea, man is the measure. For the Greeks, evil was often seen as a deficiency, maybe a human error resulting from a lack of knowledge. That Socratic idea that virtue is knowledge, if you knew the good, you would do it. Or perhaps it was a result of poor upbringing, bad habits, maybe unfortunate temperament, like Aristotle discussed. Virtue led to human happiness, eudaimonia. Evil led to unhappiness. The underlying assumption was often that if people understood the advantages of behaving well, they'd choose it.
But Augustine's view is on a completely different level, isn't it?
A completely different axis, yeah. Sin is a religious term rooted in the Judeo-Christian worldview where God, not man, is the ultimate measure and the source of moral order. So to sin is to actively violate God's laws, to engage in a kind of rebellion against the divine cosmic order. It's not just a human failing or ignorance. It introduces this profound connotation of depravity, a fundamental perversion of one's nature.
And he takes this even further, arguing it's not just a lack of good.
Exactly. Evil, for Augustine, isn't merely the absence of knowledge or proper moral training. It's a positive, active inclination. There's a will to defy God's law. Humans, in their fallen state, don't just accidentally stumble into wrongdoing. He argues they actually desire evil for evil's sake sometimes. This makes sin an intentional violation, a willed act of rebellion, which for Augustine makes it doubly depraved and deserving of condemnation.
And this is where his famous work, The Confessions, comes in. The source calls it one of the most remarkable works of self-analysis ever written. He basically uses his own life story to illustrate this deep-seated concept of sin and human depravity, doesn't he?
He does. He shows that his indictment of humanity applies first and foremost to himself. He presents his life before conversion as a prime example of a degraded existence, which could only be overcome through God's transforming grace. He uses his own experiences as evidence for his universal claims about human nature.
Like the pear incident. That story is famous.
It is. And initially, it's kind of perplexing. He recounts stealing pears as a boy. He wasn't starving. He didn't even particularly want those pears. He stole them because, as he says in the passage quoted by the source, I loved my own perdition and my own faults, not the things for which I committed wrong, but wrong itself. The evil in me was foul, but I loved it.
He loved the wrongdoing itself.
That's what he says. He emphasizes that he stole them with friends, drawn by the sheer illicit pleasure of doing something forbidden, something evil. He even compares his youthful act of petty theft to the infamous Roman conspirator Catiline, suggesting they shared a root of perverse desire. It's a powerful, unsettling illustration of his point about desiring evil for its own sake.
It really is. And then there's his equally maybe even more controversial view on infant sinfulness.
Oh, yes. The source recounts his argument that even babies, who seem like the epitome of innocence, are not free from this tainted nature. He controversially suggests that a baby crying for milk, even aggressively demanding it, isn't actually innocent. He quotes himself feeling he deserved a scolding for his own infantile demands.
Seriously. Scolding a baby for crying for milk.
His argument, as quoted, is that if babies seem innocent, it is not for lack of will to do harm, but for lack of strength. It's a truly radical stance, highlighting the depth of his belief that this depravity is inherent right from the moment of birth.
So this relentlessly bleak, pessimistic view of human nature, where the vast majority of humans are innately evil, driven by self-interest and a positive inclination towards wrongdoing, this becomes his foundational psychological model, his theory of human nature.
Precisely. And the source points out that this psychological model directly dictates his political philosophy. It's the logical consequence. If humans are by nature depraved and prone to disorder, then strong coercive political institutions are absolutely necessary to restrain them, to control their sinful impulses for the sake of social order.
Because if humans were naturally good or could perfect themselves through reason or education,
then maybe government wouldn't be necessary, or at least not this kind of coercive government. But Augustine's psychology leaves him really no alternative but to advocate for robust external control. The core insight here is, because humans are so fundamentally flawed, they require external force to live together, even imperfectly.
Now, the source suggests that while his religious language might be a barrier for some modern readers, the underlying psychological premise is actually, well, quite plausible and has resonated with later secular thinkers.
That's a crucial point for understanding his enduring relevance, I think. We can sort of translate his ideas into secular terms. We can strip away the explicitly religious concepts like evil, original sin, or even lust in its theological sense, though Augustine uses lust very broadly for any disordered desire.
Right, not just sexual desire.
Not at all. But we can retain the core insight, an innate, powerful predisposition in humans to maximize their own self-interest, to be fundamentally egotistical and self-regarding, often without sufficient regard for the needs or interests of others.
Which the source connects to the idea behind his use of lust, that disordered love directed towards the self and worldly things, that deep conviction that the world revolves around me and exists for my pleasure and gain.
Exactly. And the source explicitly draws a line from this Augustinian view to later, more modern, secular thinkers. It notes that Thomas Hobbes, a huge figure in modern political philosophy, essentially adopted a strikingly similar theory of human nature. Remember his famous description of the life of man in a state of nature without government?
Solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short, yeah.
Right. Because of inherent self-interest and competition. The source also brings in Sigmund Freud, suggesting his concept of the libido, basic pleasure or life drive, is maybe a secularized version of Augustine's concept of lust or disordered desire. And Freud, much like Augustine, believed that infants are far from innocent and that the rules and constraints of society are absolutely necessary for civilization to exist at all. Otherwise, as the source quotes the Freudian perspective, humans would grow up as beasts of the jungle.
So even if we find the religious language challenging, the underlying psychological premise about innate self-interest seems to resonate pretty powerfully with influential secular analyses of human behavior.
It really does. And the source urges us to take Augustine's psychology seriously, not to just dismiss it because it's framed theologically. It forces us to confront potentially uncomfortable truths about ourselves and others, our tendency to prioritize our own desires, to rationalize selfish behavior, to mask self-serving motives in more altruistic language. Augustine, like Hobbes and Freud after him, refuses to be dishonest about this perceived reality. He is, as the source emphasizes, brutally honest. And that honesty, even if we disagree with the theological explanation, is quite compelling.
But there is that crucial difference, isn't there? The thing that sets Augustine apart from these later secular realists.
Yes, and the source highlights this vital distinction. While many secular theories see this innate self-interest as a universal and maybe unchangeable characteristic, Augustine believes that a few people, the elect, are saved by God's grace.
Grace, that's the key difference.
It is. This divine grace enables them to fundamentally overcome the worst effects of original sin and reorient their lives, organizing their desires and actions around love of God and, flowing from that, genuine love of others. This means they become truly other-regarding. This possibility of transformation through grace is unique to Augustine. However, and this is really key for his political theory, even the saved remain susceptible to temptation and can fall back into sin. So his primary psychological model, the one that shapes his view of earthly politics, as the source concludes, remains man, the sinner, the self-interested, depraved individual, is still the default setting, if you like.
Okay. So this deeply pessimistic view of humanity and the distinction between the many driven by self-interest and the few potentially transformed by grace logically extends into what the source calls Augustine's political sociology.
That's absolutely right. It flows directly. And the core concept here is the famous metaphor of the two cities. Augustine famously wrote, and the source quotes this pivotal passage, that two cities have been formed by two loves. The earthly by love of self, even to contempt of God. The heavenly by love of God, even to contempt of self.
And he describes the ruling principles of these two, well, hypothetical societies. In the earthly city, princes and nations are ruled by the love of ruling, which sounds like a form of pride and domination.
Exactly. While in the heavenly city, princes and subjects serve one another in love, reflecting true humility and charity.
Now, this is a critical point that the source emphasizes needs to be understood correctly. It even references a footnote about it. These two cities are not meant to represent real existing institutions on earth, right? Like, it's not simply the church versus the state or Rome versus some ideal Christian community.
Absolutely not. That's a common misunderstanding. They are sociopolitical concepts. They are metaphors for the two fundamental types of human beings, categorized by their dominant love or ruling principle. You've got the many driven by lust, meaning self-love and disordered desire for worldly things, and the few driven by genuine love, meaning the love of God and, through that, the love of neighbor.
So the actual people belonging to the earthly city or the heavenly city are mixed together in the real world. You could have members of the heavenly city, those saved by grace, living and working within the institutions of the earthly city, maybe serving in the state, even leading it imperfectly.
Right, and you could certainly have members of the earthly city, people driven purely by self-interest within the visible church, participating in its rituals, but without genuine faith or transformed love.
So the membership is invisible, essentially, known only to God.
Pretty much. The source clarifies that institutionally, the church represents the values and orientation of the city of God in the world, and the state tends to represent the values and orientation of the earthly city. But the actual membership of the two cities is intertwined in earthly reality.
And this fundamental mingling of radically different human types, the deeply self-interested mass and the few transformed by love, this presents Augustine with a significant political challenge. Actually, two related problems stemming directly from his psychology and sociology.
Yeah, the first, and the source calls it the more serious, foundational problem is this. If the vast majority of humanity are citizens of the earthly city, driven by antisocial individualism, motivated by self-interest and a propensity for depravity, how is any social or political organization even possible among them? What foundation is there for a state or a stable society when everyone is fundamentally looking out only for themselves? His assessment of human nature seems to leave very little basis for constructive political theory.
It sounds like it makes politics almost impossible.
Almost. And the subsidiary problem then is, how can the citizens of the heavenly city, those few who are made social and other regarding by divine love, possibly coexist and live alongside the overwhelming mass of sinners from the earthly city in this mixed reality? They have fundamentally different values, different goals, different loves.
Which brings us to the solution that might seem most obvious, the one that Augustine, according to the source, explicitly rejects, just separating them.
Right. Physical separation, like the idea of withdrawing from the corrupt world to form an ideal community of the good, perhaps like Plato's vision of a just republic where the wise rule.
Exactly. But Augustine says no.
He rejects this utopian ideal outright, according to the source. Why? For that fundamental reason we just discussed. Only God truly knows who belongs to which city. The wheat and the tares, the saved and the damned, they're mixed together in this life and will only be separated at the final judgment. Therefore, physical separation of the good from the bad is simply impossible for human beings to achieve accurately.
So saints and sinners are just stuck together.
Inextricably mixed and must find a way to live together in the real world. And the source presents this firm rejection of utopianism and separatism as a key marker of Augustine's political realism.
So it's actually a strength of his theory, not a weakness.
The source argues it is. He's lauded for refusing easy, idealistic solutions. It points out that historical separatist movements, whether religiously motivated like certain monastic communities trying to withdraw, or politically motivated trying to form pure, ideal communities, they generally face two major obstacles. They often fail, partly because their principles are just too demanding for most people to live up to,
Right.
and partly because even if they succeed in forming a small community, they still need the protection of the wider, sinful world from which they've tried to isolate themselves. Augustine, by understanding that mixture is inevitable, is forced to seek a solution that works within that messy reality. He doesn't offer a retreat from the problem of coexisting with sinners.
Okay, so if separation isn't the answer, if saints and sinners have to live together, how does he propose these two fundamentally different groups can coexist in any kind of order?
He needs to find a value, a desire, something that is held in common by everyone, regardless of their ultimate spiritual state, their dominant motivations, self-love or love of God or their beliefs, something that unites them despite their fundamental differences.
And for Augustine, drawing from the source, that universally desired value is peace.
Peace. Yeah. Given his view of human nature, that seems almost counterintuitive, doesn't it?
It does. How can sinners desire peace?
But it's precisely because of his view of human nature that peace becomes so crucial. As the source explains it, neither the lover of God, the saint, nor the lover of self, the sinner, can achieve their desired ends in this life without some degree of peace and social order. The saint needs peace to be able to worship God, practice their faith, pursue salvation without constant disruption and chaos.
Okay, that makes sense for the saint, but the sinner?
The sinner needs peace to pursue and enjoy their worldly pleasures, to accumulate wealth, exercise power, and generally live out their self-interested desires without facing constant conflict and violence. Think about it. Social disorder and utter chaos are undesirable to absolutely everyone in this life, even if for entirely different reasons.
Okay, I see. So the desire for peace serves as a kind of fundamental, universally shared value, a relative good, even if people want it for vastly different ultimate reasons.
Yes, it's the necessary precondition for any kind of civilized life and for the state to exist at all, according to Augustine. But the truly ingenious part, as the source highlights, is how this shared desire for peace also solves that deeper, more serious problem. How do you get the mass of sinners, the antisocial individualists driven purely by self-interest, to live together in a structured way?
Right? How does the desire for peace solve the problem of antisocial individualism?
Because even profoundly self-interested people need peace and a degree of social order among themselves to successfully pursue their worldly goods. If everyone was only maximizing their own immediate self-interest without any external constraint or common ground, you would, as we touched on, descend into utter chaos, conflict, civil war, a situation where no one could reliably acquire or enjoy the fruits of their self-interest. There'd be no property, no security, no leisure.
Back to Hobbes. Solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short.
Exactly. So even members of the earthly city desire peace among themselves for this fundamentally selfish, pragmatic reason. They recognize, maybe implicitly, that some form of order is necessary for their own self-preservation and the pursuit of their disordered desires. And that's why they will support the state, because the state is the institution that enforces the minimal level of peace and order they need for their own pursuits.
Ah, okay. That's where the source says Augustine ingeniously overcomes the dilemma. He takes the very problem of human nature and turns it into the solution for political order.
He does. The source, specifically referencing the analysis of the scholar Herbert Dean, emphasizes this crucial point. Self-interest, lust, which is the source of disorder in human relations, is also paradoxically the source of the desire for peace that makes the state possible. It's a state built on vice, essentially, but designed to mitigate the worst consequences of that vice.
And this theory of the state is just a radical departure from classical thought, isn't it?
Oh, an absolutely stark contrast. Think about Plato and Aristotle, or even the Roman Cicero. They saw the state, the polis, or the civitas as a natural institution, an organic part of human life, the necessary context for human flourishing. They believed the state was, or at least ideally should be, a moral community designed to promote goodness, virtue, and the highest human ends. Cicero famously couldn't even conceive of truly human life existing outside of organized society and the polity. The state was seen as a positive good.
But Augustine sees it completely differently.
Fundamentally, for Augustine, drawing from this source, the state is not natural, it's conventional. It's an artificial institution, a necessary consequence of humanity's fallen nature, created purely for limited, pragmatic, and ultimately selfish purposes, primarily maintaining peace so people can pursue their lusts.
If everyone were citizens of the heavenly city.
Exactly. If everyone were motivated by love and lived in perfect harmony, the state, at least in its coercive form, wouldn't be needed. Because it's created out of self-interest, the source notes, it's a community in name only. It cannot be a moral community in the classical sense because it appeals not to people's capacity for virtue, which he believes most lack, but to their sinful needs, their desire for peace purely as a means to pursue their own ends.
And his view of law, then, follows directly from this unconventional theory of the state.
It's a logical extension. Just like the state itself, Augustine sees law as conventional artificial rules created by human authority only for the purpose of maintaining external social order. And crucially, people obey these laws not because they believe it's the morally right thing to do in service of some common good.
But why then?
Out of self-interest.
Yeah.
Specifically, the fear of the consequences, the punishment if they break the law.
So fear is the primary mechanism by which law functions for Augustine. That seems bleak.
According to the source, yes, it is pretty bleak. The law's main function in this fallen world is to engender fear, because fear is what effectively appeals to people's underlying self-interest, their desire to avoid pain, punishment, or the disruption of their ability to pursue worldly goods. He just does not believe the vast majority would obey for altruistic reasons or because they inherently value justice for its own sake. The blunt takeaway here is that law for Augustine isn't primarily about making you good, it's about controlling your badness through fear.
Again, a clear contrast with classical thinkers like Aristotle or Cicero, who saw law and lawmaking as part of the pursuit of the good life, as an ethical activity.
Precisely. For them, engaging in lawmaking and obeying the law were integral to people's telos, their ultimate purpose or end as political animals. Legislating was a noble activity involving deliberation about what was good for the entire community. Obedience wasn't just about avoiding punishment. It was rooted in a belief in the moral rightness of obedience and its contribution to the flourishing of the whole community.
And Augustine's view of political activity itself, the act of engaging in politics, is equally, if not more, pessimistic, right?
He fundamentally does not see it as a natural activity or an arena for moral growth or the achievement of excellence, unlike Aristotle. Augustine believes that most people engage in politics purely to promote their own self-interest, driven by what he explicitly calls the lust for power or glory.
Lust for power.
Yeah. Those who love ruling, those who seek positions of political authority are, in his view, sinners, plain and simple. Engaging in politics, far from making you morally better, as Aristotle might suggest, actually makes you morally worse, because it feeds the deadly sin of pride, the desire to dominate others and seek worldly acclaim. That Aristotelian desire to excel in the polis, Augustine sees it as just vanity and pride.
So the source says Augustine doesn't simply reject classical thought, he displaces it. What does that mean exactly?
That's a crucial analytical point made by the source. He doesn't deny that virtue, human flourishing, happiness are our proper telos, our ultimate end or purpose. But he denies that this end can be achieved in this world through earthly political life.
Ah, so it's achievable, just not here.
Exactly. True virtue, true happiness, the true rewards like nobility or immortality, they're only attainable in heaven from God. He performs a radical shift, relocating the source of human values and the real end of life from the earthly polis to the heavenly realm. He wants people's ethical striving, their deepest longing for fulfillment, directed away from the temporary, flawed world of politics and towards the eternal life with God.
And the consequence of this displacement, as the source points out, is a radical separation of ethics and politics.
Yes, it puts them into distinct, almost irreconcilable categories. Ethics, the realm of true goodness, love, virtue, belongs primarily to the otherworldly, the pursuit of God and salvation. Politics, the realm of the state, law, power, belongs to the worldly, a messy, necessary consequence of sin driven by self-interest and fear. The realms are largely separate and irreducible to one another.
And a major consequence of this separation, the source argues, is that it fundamentally denigrates the importance of political theory itself.
Right. Why would you study something deeply, something as complex as earthly politics, if it doesn't contribute to human fulfillment or moral well-being in this life? His theory, in this sense, lacks the comprehensive nature of classical thought, which saw the political and ethical spheres as deeply intertwined and mutually supportive in the pursuit of the good life here and now.
And this lack of concern about the specifics of worldly politics is reflected in his surprising lack of detailed discussion about different forms of government, isn't it?
Absolutely. If the state is essentially a necessary evil, a conventional institution created out of humanity's fallen nature and based on worldly, self-interested values, then its particular form, whether it's a tyranny, an oligarchy, a democracy, whatever, doesn't really matter that much in the grand scheme of things. They are all, in his view, just variations on a theme, earthly kingdoms grappling with the consequences of sin.
Because changing the system doesn't fix the core problem.
Exactly. Since ethics is detached from politics in this world, altering the political constitution or changing who rules cannot fundamentally improve human beings either individually or collectively. The root problem, sin, isn't solved by political means. There is no best form of government, no ideal political arrangement that can bring about a final good or true justice in this world for him.
And that leads to that really striking quote the source provides.
Oh, yeah, the one that would have utterly astounded classical thinkers like Aristotle or Cicero, who saw politics as essential to defining the good life. Augustine says, as far as this life of mortals is concerned, what does it matter under whose government a dying man lives?
Oh, just wow. That really underscores his perspective that earthly political life is ultimately fleeting, secondary, relatively insignificant compared to the eternal fate of the soul.
It does, and this perspective must significantly diminish the status and importance of citizenship and political participation for the individual. Well, because he denies any real ethical content to lawmaking and political activity in this world, he effectively debases the status of citizenship. The act of participating in the political community, making and obeying laws, which was seen as a defining characteristic of human excellence and a central part of the good life in classical thought, is portrayed by Augustine largely as being driven by the lust for power or glory, by worldly ambition rather than genuine concern for a shared, virtuous life. While he doesn't deny that Christians have civic duties, they should obey the law, contribute to earthly peace, he certainly doesn't glorify citizenship or participation like Aristotle did. The emphasis shifts dramatically from the active, virtuous citizen to the obedient, passive subject.
And his view of political authority itself is described in the source as distinctly paternalistic and authoritarian.
Yes. The source notes that Augustine says remarkably little about the specifics of political rule beyond insisting on the absolute necessity of obedience to political authorities, regardless of how good or how bad the ruler might be personally, or how just the regime seems.
But there's a limit, right? You don't have to obey everything.
There is one crucial caveat. A subject must not obey a command that requires them to commit a sinful act, a violation of God's law. But, and this is key even in such cases, disobedience must be purely passive. There is absolutely no room in Augustine's thought for active resistance, rebellion, or revolution against the established political authority. You suffer the consequences, you don't fight back.
And this absolute requirement for passive obedience is rooted in his theocratic theory of the state.
Right. Augustine fundamentally believes that all legitimate state authority derives ultimately from God, not from the consent of the governed or from the people. This divine origin makes the ruler's authority absolute in the eyes of the subject, limited only by God-given ethical rules, what Augustine would identify with natural law or divine revelation. But, and this is crucial, it is the ruler, not the subject, who determines whether or not these God-given rules are being honored in practice.
So the ruler's power is absolute in relation to the subject, and the citizen is essentially powerless to challenge it. No rights in the modern sense.
Precisely. The source notes that in this Augustinian theocratic view, the citizen is not seen as a repository of inherent rights in the modern sense, nor as an active participant in the classical sense, but primarily as a passive subject whose duty is obedience.
And this applied to any state, even a tyrannical pagan one. That seems extreme.
Yes, the source strongly emphasizes this point. His theocratic theory applies to any state, Christian or atheist, good or evil, benevolent or tyrannical. Even tyrants, in Augustine's view, derive their authority from God. This makes their rule legitimate in terms of its divine origin, even if the ruler acts unjustly. A good Christian must submit even to a tyrannical regime, refusing only specific commands to sin, and suffering the consequences passively, never raising a hand against the state or challenging the ruler's fundamental right to rule.
Okay, but how does that square with his other point, that the state is just a conventional institution resulting from sin, created for pragmatic peace? It sounds contradictory.
The source explains it's not actually a contradiction in his mind. The state might have originated from humanity's fallen nature and been created out of the necessity for pragmatic peace among self-interested sinners. But once it exists, Augustine asserts that its authority is legitimate and binding because it is sanctioned and permitted by God. Whatever its sordid origins or the quality of its rule, its authority is ultimately divinely given, making obedience a religious as well as a civic duty.
And this theocratic view became hugely influential, didn't it? Shaping medieval thought for centuries.
It did. Augustine's concept of divinely ordained authority became accepted doctrine for much of the medieval period, though later thinkers, like Thomas Aquinas, would soften some of Augustine's more extreme authoritarian implications. But Augustine himself, as the source notes, remained adamant in his very strong authoritarian concept of authority deriving solely from God.
And it's pretty easy to see why this perspective would be deeply unappealing to modern civil libertarians or anyone who believes in the right of people to change or overthrow a bad government.
Absolutely. People who advocate for rights, democracy, or revolution fundamentally believe that politics is directly connected to moral well-being, that this world is important, and that human agency can improve or fundamentally alter the political realm. Augustine's perspective is almost the opposite of this.
Because he sees politics
As a realm of sin and temporary necessity, and he wants people's ultimate attention and hope directed towards God and the next life. Earthly political suffering or injustice is secondary to eternal salvation. And even as the source notes in a particularly striding point, he suggests that passively submitting to an evil regime and suffering under it might actually be beneficial to the saint, helping to purify and prepare the soul for eternal life through hardship.
beneficial suffering. That's a hard concept to swallow today.
It is, but it's fully consistent with his otherworldly focus. So the source traces many of the limitations or weaknesses of Augustine's political theory, his denigration of politics, his indifference to forms of government, his authoritarianism back to his fundamental dualism.
That stark separation he draws between good and evil, lust and love, the earthly city and the heavenly city, and most significantly for political theory, between ethics and politics. For him, these realms are inherently separate and largely irreconcilable in this world.
Yes. But here's the great paradox the source points to, the reason for his enduring importance. Augustine's weaknesses are also, in a profound sense, his strengths.
How does that work? How can the weaknesses be strengths?
Well, this is key to understanding why he remains so influential. While his dualism might seem to lead to a diminished view of politics, it's built upon that psychological theory of human nature, the brutally honest assessment of innate self-interest and depravity that is incredibly difficult to simply dismiss, even today. If humans are fundamentally as selfish and antisocial as he describes, then maybe that separation between ethics and politics is a necessary reality in this world. Maybe earthly politics can't be a realm of pure virtue.
So what looks like a theoretical impoverishment isn't a failure on his part, but maybe a reflection of his realistic assessment of politics' inherent limitations.
Well, that's exactly the argument the source makes. And this realism, this clear-eyed view of human imperfection and political limitations, means he avoids two common pitfalls. Crippling cynicism, just giving up on any collective life, and naive utopianism, the belief that a perfect earthly society free from conflict and vice is achievable through political means.
And he has a unique way of addressing the problem of human nature within politics itself.
This is perhaps his most powerful and enduring contribution. He takes what the source calls the worst in humanity, selfishness, disordered desires, the lust for power, and shows how these very vices, these sources of disorder, can actually be used and channeled to produce a political good, namely peace and order. He turns the very problem of sinful human nature into a political solution.
Wow.
The source quotes a powerful summary of this idea that perfectly captures the Augustinian genius. Sin can be used to control the consequences of sin. And it notes that this idea, stripped of its religious context, prefigures and underlies a lot of modern thought about how political and economic systems function by channeling self-interest.
Okay, how does he show sin being used to control sin? Give me an example.
Well, his argument is that while people's innate antisocial tendencies should make civilization impossible, Augustine shows that these very tendencies, particularly the self-interested desire for peace and order as a means to pursue their own worldly goods, can be harnessed to create and maintain political stability. Their desire to avoid the chaos of a war of all against all compels them to support the state.
Okay, so self-interest leads to supporting the state for peace. And the law.
Law works because it leverages people's self-interest in avoiding pain and punishment. Fear instilled by the law compels obedience, controlling their inclination to disobey. It's not making them virtuous, but controlling the consequences of their lack of virtue.
And power. That lust for power.
That very desire for power, while a sin in his book, is also what ensures that state offices are filled, that rulers step up or push others aside to govern, and that laws are legislated and enforced. Without that drive, even flawed as it is, the state simply couldn't function. So, the vices of the earthly city provide the energy and motivation necessary to maintain its fragile, imperfect order.
That's quite a turnaround, turning vice into political virtue almost.
In a functional sense, yes. Another strength the source highlights is how Augustine's dualism enables him to strip away pretense and look at politics with just radical honesty.
How does the dualism help with that?
By drawing that sharp line between ethics and politics, between the heavenly and the earthly, Augustine is able to look past the noble rhetoric and idealist claims that often surround political life and expose what the source calls the often brutal and vicious facts of political life. His philosophy compels a consistently honest, realistic, and sometimes uncomfortable assessment of politics as it actually functions in the fallen world.
And his response to the pagan critics of Rome in the City of God is the prime example of this ruthless honesty, right?
Exactly. He's not just defending Christianity, he's dismantling the pagan idealization of Rome. He argues they were wrong to blame Christianity for Rome's fall, asserting that decline is inherent to all earthly kingdoms because of the pervasive nature of sin and decay in this world. Only the heavenly city is eternal and immune to this. But more than that, he argues the pagan critics fail to read their own history accurately. They cling to an idealized view of Rome as fundamentally just and embodying noble aspirations.
And this is where that powerful line comes in again, the one that grabbed us at the start. Judge them naked.
It is. He challenges them and us to look past the glorious facade. Away with the deceitful masks. Look at the naked deeds. Weigh them naked. Judge them naked. He then systematically exposes the harsh reality of Roman history as presented in the source. A history of abusing power, waging unjust wars of conquest, subduing provinces by brutal force, violence against the innocent, internal class conflict, state power being used primarily by one group to suppress others.
He even critiques the supposedly virtuous period of the Republic, the Golden Age.
He does. He argues that even back then, the great Roman heroes and leaders who claimed to be motivated by concern for the public good were, in reality, primarily driven by pride and vanity, the lust for fame and glory. Their civic virtue was often just a more respectable form of selfish ambition.
And he extends this devastating analysis beyond just Rome, doesn't he, to all earthly states.
Yes, the source makes it clear that his expose of Rome applies, in principle, to all states in the fallen world because true, perfect justice, except in a very imperfect and limited sense, simply cannot exist on Earth. This leads him to that famous and deeply challenging conclusion we started with. Without justice, what are kingdoms but great robberies?
And to drive this point home, to make it vivid and unforgettable, the source includes that story from Cicero's Commonwealth that Augustine himself recounts. The pirate story.
Ah, yes, the story of the pirate captured by Alexander the Great. When the mighty Emperor Alexander demanded to know by what right the pirate plundered the sea, the pirate, with remarkable audacity, replied by turning the question back on Alexander, asking by what right he himself plundered the whole earth.
Turning the tables.
Completely. The pirate's devastating punchline, as quoted in the source, was, "Because I do it with a petty ship, I am called a robber, whilst thou who dost it with a great fleet are styled emperor."
Oof. That story is so effective because it just strips away all the justifications and grand language of empire and equates large-scale conquest and state power with petty theft. It highlights the role of sheer force and scale in determining whether an act is labeled criminal or glorious conquest.
It absolutely does. It forces you to look at the raw reality of power acquisition and use. And the source doesn't just leave this in the ancient past, it directly challenges us to apply this same rigorous Augustinian analysis to our own political institutions today.
Right. The text asks, quite pointedly, how would the United States stand up to this kind of analysis? Is it just? Has it ever been fundamentally just according to this standard?
And it prompts us, the readers, to consider specific historical and contemporary examples, directly mentioned in the source, through an Augustinian lens. The process of settling the country under the banner of manifest destiny and its devastating impact on Native Americans. The long, brutal history of slavery, which was constitutionally protected and socially condoned for centuries.
And even domestic politics today.
Exactly. Is it truly driven by concern for the public good, or more often by the pursuit of special interests and political gain? The source asks us to consider politicians' motivations. Are they primarily driven by a genuine care for the future and their constituents, or by increasing their own status, power, or financial gain? It asks if politicians use public trust ethically, or if unethical behavior is more prevalent than we'd like to admit, lurking just beneath the surface of the public image.
An Augustinian analysis, by its very nature, compels us to look for the naked deeds behind the rhetoric and the ideals, doesn't it?
It really does. The source notes that an Augustinian analysis can be profoundly devastating and uncomfortable precisely because his framework, his dualism, his view of politics as an arena of sin and corruption driven by self-interest, and the lust for power compels him and compels us to look for injustice, corruption, and self-interest beneath the surface, where we might prefer to see virtue and public spirit.
This method of analysis, this clear-eyed focus on power and interest over ideals, this is what's known as realpolitik, right?
Correct. The theory of realpolitik, as understood from this source, is characterized by its rejection of sentimentality and idealism in politics. It sees politics, whether domestic or international, fundamentally as a struggle for power. It explicitly denies the unity of ethics and politics and rejects the idea that the state can be a true moral community in the classical sense.
But the source emphasizes that Augustine isn't advocating for politics to be this way. He's describing what he believes politics is in the fallen world. It's descriptive, not prescriptive.
That's a vital distinction. Realpolitik, for Augustine, is a brutal fact of the human condition and the earthly realm, not a political goal to strive for or an ideal to implement. He's describing the reality of politics driven by human sin, not prescribing how politics should be conducted if humans were different.
And despite this really dark view of earthly politics and human nature, there is still hope within his overall system, isn't there?
Yes, absolutely. For the members of the heavenly city, those few who are saved by grace and whose lives are reoriented towards the love of God, he offers the promise of true moral fulfillment and human happiness. But that fulfillment is located in the world to come, in eternal life with God. It's for those who, in a sense, refuse full citizenship in the flawed, temporary, worldly kingdoms of this life and direct their ultimate loyalty and hope elsewhere.
So, why is St. Augustine's political theory still relevant today? The source argues it's definitely not outmoded, despite its ancient origins.
Because, as the source says, great ideas tend to transcend their specific historical context. We might not be living through the literal collapse of a Roman Empire or debating the finer points of 5th century church politics or paganism, but the general theory of politics that Augustine developed in response to those issues, particularly his insights into human nature and the dynamics of power, remains profoundly important.
By focusing unflinchingly on what the source calls the hidden underside of humanity and politics.
He gave us, as the source powerfully puts it, a dark and timeless vision. The lasting impact of reading Augustine or engaging with his core ideas is that you can never again look at your own political institutions, your own leaders, or yourselves without judging naked that which you would rather not see.
That's quite a legacy.
It is. His brutal honesty, his willingness to expose the gap between political ideals and the often grimy reality of power and self-interest endures as a powerful, albeit challenging, lens through which to view the world.
Well, this has truly been a deep dive into some complex and, challenging ideas. We've journeyed through St. Augustine's dualistic worldview, shaped by his turbulent times and profound personal and intellectual influences. We've explored his intensely pessimistic psychology of human nature, centered on original sin and innate self-interest, and how this necessitates coercive political control.
We've seen his unconventional view of the state, not as a natural or moral community, but as an artificial, conventional institution necessary only to maintain a fragile peace born out of people's selfish desire for order. We've discussed his radical separation of ethics from politics, his belief in a paternalistic, God-given authority requiring passive obedience,
And the enduring power of his realpolitik analysis in stripping away pretense and exposing the often harsh realities of power and self-interest at work in the political realm.
And understanding Augustine, even if you ultimately disagree with his theological premises or his political conclusions, it provides an incredibly powerful and sharp tool for analysis. It forces a kind of radical honesty about human motivation and the nature of power that can be uncomfortable, forcing us to look at things we might prefer to ignore, but which is perhaps essential for developing a truly realistic view of the world.
And that leaves us with a provocative thought to carry forward, one that builds directly on the source's challenging conclusion. If Augustine compels us to look at politics naked, to judge the naked deeds rather than the lofty rhetoric, what uncomfortable truths might we uncover about the political systems we live under, about the people who lead them, and perhaps most revealingly, about ourselves when we apply that unflinching Augustinian lens today?
That is a question well worth pondering deeply.
Absolutely. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the fascinating and challenging world of St. Augustine's political thought. We hope you'll continue to reflect on these powerful ideas.